Hello Internet, Taliesin here, and today we are talking Anduin, and corrupted Anduin, and the Archon, and the stabbed Archon, and Uther, and Sylvanas, and the Jailer, and Arthas, and the keys of the Shadowlands, and more besides, because ladies and gentlemen, we have a new cinematic to analyse. Kingsmourne, head and shoulders the most exciting and impressive part of BlizzCon's Shadowlands reveals, and genuinely one of my favourite Warcraft cinematics of all time. Yeah, I know, and I can't wait to tell you why. So before I do, the usual disclaimer, this is not a reaction video. I have watched this cinematic an unhealthy amount of times already now, and if you haven't, then this video is a terrible way of doing so, because we are going to be stopping and starting and skipping bits and talking all over it and just generally having a geek out deep divey time. If that sounds like your sort of thing, then join us as we ask, can Anduin be saved? Will Sylvanas break? And exactly who has the other keys that the Jailer needs? Okay, go, 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 go.
Despite all our efforts, the Maw continues to grow.
Our opening shot of Elysian Hold, obviously establishing where the action for this cinematic will play out, but it's also, of course, a callback to the very first cinematic of this expansion, the Bastion Afterlives. The angle that we see the Hold from, recreating our first sight of it as Uther is carried there by Devos. But there's a very important difference this time around, and that is in the music. Something this whole cinematic does unusually well, even for WoW animations, is its use of sound and music to tell the story. And here is a great example of that. In Afterlives, this image was accompanied by literal choirs of angels, presenting Elysian Hold as this noble, heavenly place. Not so in the Kingsmourne cinematic, where the music is tension-filled, on edge, uncomfortable even, because a lot has changed in Bastion and in the Shadowlands since that Afterlives intro.
Despite all our efforts, the Maw continues to grow.
The recreation of a shot here is being used to underline a difference. The Kyrian are no longer the confident, unshakable Boy Scout Smurf Lords that they were. Elysian Hold, not the untouchable fortress of righteousness. It's been attacked and partially destroyed twice since then in the Bastion Covenant campaign, and there's a new air of uncertainty about the place. And this is emphasized by the conversation that happens next, which starts in voiceover over this shot, that of a lone, echoey voice. Again, its vulnerability at odds with the strength and power that we should associate with the grand seat of the Archon.
What if Denathrius' treachery is irreparable? The Primus is lost, and Bastion cannot save the Shadowlands alone.
None of this should have happened.
And when we see the Archon, again, it's not like in the Afterlife cinematic where she towers godlike above us, surrounded by gold and warmth and sunshine and statues and images of power. Instead, she is a part of what looks like a secret council meeting in the corridors below the Hold. It's actually the Sanctum of Binding, which Bastion players will be familiar with, but the art team have upped the blues in the colour composition for this image to make it darker and colder than it is in game. Like she and the other Ascended are hiding out in a bunker almost, while the war batters them from all sides. Although, fair play to her, she is still flying, and I can't blame her for that, because she's not wearing any shoes, and those marble tiles must get pretty cold in the shade. But yeah, us seeing the Archon and her circle in this new setting straight away establishes them as taking cover, hunkering down and protecting themselves, as is the dialogue that goes with it, where Thenios lays out in no uncertain terms that the Kyrian are in the shit. The Archon's "none of this should have happened" has a regretful, reflective air about it, doesn't it? She's not blaming anyone else for this situation but herself. It was her that either ignored Devos or acted too late on her warnings of the Jailer's growing power. It was her who failed to protect Elysian Hold from first the attack of the Forsworn, then got her ass handed to her by Devos and Spires of Ascension, and then sent all her champions to attack the Sanctum of Courage and left Elysian Hold at the mercy of the Moorsworn. It's been a rough old time for the Archon, and frankly, it's not about to get any better. But it's interesting to me that she appears able to reflect and accept responsibility for all of these failings. The Kyrian are often presented as quite zealoty, adhering mindlessly to a set path, but actually throughout their Covenant campaign, we've seen them learn and evolve and appreciate that their methods might have limitations. And I think this moment of introspection from the Archon, so unshakable in the Afterlife cinematic, is emblematic of that. None of this should have happened. I should have listened, or I should have prevented it, being the implicated end of her thought. Oh, and I love this line.
Perhaps the Winter Queen could...
And of course, we don't know exactly what he's going to suggest, but in my head, in these desperate times, he is going to say that the Winter Queen could ask her sister for help. That's what he was going to say, and Steve Danusa himself cannot convince me otherwise. Okay, Steve Danusa probably could. He would probably know, in fairness, but no one else can convince me otherwise. Man, I can't wait to find out more about that. But anyway, now that we've established that Bastion, and by implication the entire Shadowlands, are in trouble, this entire scene is about to get turned on its head as Clea swoops in.
My Archon, a living soul, seeks an audience.
A mortal?
A king.
And actually now the setting of this part of the scene takes on another cool meaning, because like I say, this is the sanctum of binding. This is a place of absolute trust, where souls bind themselves to each other and give each other strength. So for this to be where the arrival of Anduin, and with him a moment of deceit and violent treachery, is introduced, carries even more weight. Like that part in Macbeth where the king is discussing the traitorous Thane of Cawdor and says, "He was a gentleman on whom I built an absolute trust," just before Macbeth enters. A lot of people have commented on the Kyrians' supposedly very lax security here in letting Anduin just waltz straight in and gain an audience with the Archon, but the answers are all in the cinematic if you just listen and look. As we've established, the Kyrian are on the back foot here. They are not scared perhaps, but they are definitely looking for a ray of hope. They were about to ask the Winter Queen to get her sister to help out, for goodness sake, and when Clea makes a point of saying that the mortal who seeks an audience is a king, there is hope in her eyes. This guy has strength and influence, maybe an army. This is the powerful ally that the council were just lamenting they didn't have. And that, added to the fact that the only mortal the Archon knows is us, and we've saved her ass multiple times, and these lines.
By all our measures, one who has spent his life striving for justice. One who would give anything to serve his people. One whose heart is true.
Make you realize exactly how Anduin bypasses Kyrian security and exactly why the jailer needed him in the first place. Because Anduin is exactly the kind of soul who belongs in Bastion, one who is dedicated to serving his people, dedicated to justice, one whose heart is true. The implication is that in all likelihood, if Anduin were to die, he would go to Bastion as his covenant. When the jailer talked about making Anduin his weapon, it is these parts of Anduin that he wanted to weaponize, because it is these qualities that Anduin has and which the Kyrian sense that allow him to become welcome in Bastion. And with this, one of the first big mysteries of Shadowlands is explained from the intro scenario in the Moor. When you're in that cave with Jaina and Thrall and they're telling the player about their capture and torture by the jailer in that really long unskippable dialogue which you hate so much every time you run an alt through it. Thrall says it felt like the jailer was testing them, and this is what he was testing them for, the qualities he needed to get him into Bastion and attack the Archon. With that in mind, it's pretty hilarious that he takes one look at Bane, says, "Yeah, you ain't getting into Bastion, son," and throws him off a cliff. But Anduin has the right stuff. The way he selflessly holds the line for the player characters to escape at the end of that scenario, maybe being the moment that convinces the jailer once and for all that he is the beautiful angel-faced crying boy who is weirdly even more beautiful when he cries for the job. Interesting, he says when he sees Anduin displaying his power. But to be honest, it's totally understandable if people missed that very important dialogue when watching this, because visually there is some awesome and very distracting stuff going on underneath. And this sequence right here, you know, I think these cinematics generally are really good. It's why I make these deep dive videos into them. But this sequence right here is simply exquisite and an example of pretty much everything that's so good about them. The combination of visual storytelling with incredibly expressive animation and incredible sound design is just masterful here. There's a great use of what's called dramatic irony. We, the viewer, know something that the characters we are watching don't. Because whereas the Archon and the Kyrian are aware that Anduin has been held captive by the jailer, we know from the previous cinematics that the jailer and Sylvanas have the means to compel Anduin to enact their will. The last time we saw Anduin, he was on the verge of being compelled by the Mournblade that the jailer crafted, and the climax of that scene was presented as a choice for Sylvanas. Would she use the blade to control him, or wouldn't she? So we, as a viewer, know that this Anduin could be good guy Anduin, and maybe Sylvanas released him, but we also know that he could be jailer-controlled Anduin, and this is all part of the plan. And us knowing it could be either one, but not knowing which it is, builds this incredible tension throughout the build-up, which Blizz play beautifully, I think. Because when you know that this guy could be his normal good guy dedicated to pure justice-hearted self, or he could be a weapon, the slightest hint that it could be the bad option ratchets up that tension another notch. So when Anduin arrives and we see him from behind taking in Elysian Hall before him, the next obvious shot, the one that we in our modern media literate minds subconsciously expect as a viewer, is the reverse angle, to see Anduin's face taking in the sight of the seat of the Archon. So when we aren't allowed to see his face, that's a bit weird, and it takes the tension up a notch. When we see the action from this really quite strange outer body floaty above angle, the weird unnaturalness of it takes the tension up a notch. When we get this beautiful moment, my favourite moment in the entire thing, where we follow Anduin from behind as he walks past Uther, and Uther has this remarkable reaction, it takes the tension up a notch. And let's unpack this moment properly. First of all, the fact that Uther is being led away from Archon's rise by Kyrian guards actually places this scene at a very precise moment in time. This scene is happening literally seconds after the end of the Kyrian Covenant campaign, as a repentant, shamed, confused, and defeated Uther is led off in this exact way. If you haven't done that campaign, and 3/4 of you probably haven't, he's just realised that Devos, who he put his faith in, had betrayed him and been in league with the jailer. The cause of the Forsworn that he had dedicated himself to fighting for had been a lie, and he has some serious soul searching to do, and is understandably in a very vulnerable place right now. And his face as Anduin walks past him is so brilliant. Taran Gregory directed this film, but frankly I could have told you that anyway, because I've noticed Taran has been giving special attention to eyes in his latest work, and the eye acting animation here is incredible and shows you exactly what is going on, because as Uther catches a glimpse of Anduin in profile, eyes, the part of a character that give away so much in these cinematics, like I just said, still hidden from the viewer, and the music shifts seamlessly from the Stormwind theme into Invincible. Uther clearly thinks, for a moment at least, that his old student and the cause of his death and subsequent strife, Arthas, has just strode past. Just to clarify one thing I've heard people talking about, there's no way that he would recognise this person as Anduin. Even if they ever met in life, which is far from guaranteed, Anduin would have been like a toddler or something when Uther died. But Uther mistaking Anduin for Arthas, even if just for a second, does 3 things. 1, it reminds us where Uther's head is at right now. His preoccupation with Arthas, which is what led him to joining the baddies in Kyrian, and clearly still haunts him now. 2, it really hammers home the Anduin Arthas parallels that these cinematics have been working incredibly hard to draw and make obvious to us since the very beginning of BFA, where we had Anduin literally recreate Arthas' entrance into the throne room of Lordaeron from Warcraft 3. And why are Blizz trying to push those parallels? Why is associating Anduin with Arthas so important? Is it because Anduin is really Arthas' secret love child, secret son though? No, it's not. It would be easy to see this cinematic as something of an answer Uther, actually, as a culmination of those years of parallels that Blizz have been drawing. Because Arthas was, we now know, in some ways, a tool of the Jailer, who wrought destruction with the Jailer's power. It would be reasonable to conclude that Blizz have been so insistent on making Anduin remind us of Arthas in the way that they present him in cinematics as a foreshadowing of this very moment, where Anduin also is used as a tool by the Jailer. And if that is all it is, that's plenty, but I think there might be more. For one, Arthas used his power to create Sylvanas as we know her, killing the Ranger General and raising her, and arguably with that giving her this complex that she has about control and agency, hers being taken away from her when Arthas raised her as a Banshee. And remember that Arthas killing and raising Sylvanas in Warcraft 3, he used the Jailer's power to do it, we now know, but the choice was his. He decided to kill her, and it was his cruelty and spitefulness that made him decide to raise her. Is Blizzard working so hard to draw these parallels with Anduin, not to culminate in this moment in Elysian Hold, but so that once again they can use the similarities to show a difference, specifically regarding Sylvanas. More on that later, I promise, because it's really very interesting. But Uther clutches the wound over his heart, the fatal wound that Arthas dealt him with Frostmourne, and which has hummed with the power of the Jailer and the Maw ever since. So again, Liz is showing us here that Uther recognizes or senses in this young blonde-haired king the power of the Maw. Another warning to us that all is not well, and again, that tension gets turned up a notch. But here's a detail I haven't seen anyone talk about, because Uther's face goes through a lot of emotions in this very short space of time. The defeated, fallen Forsworn, the man seeing a ghost that still haunts him, recognizing the dark power within Anduin, but right here at the end, there's a resilience in his eyes. I think it is in this moment where Uther's redemption truly starts. This moment where he senses the Jailer's power controlling another soul, like it eventually controlled Arthas, and the change in his expression right at the last moment we see him here, for me at least, signals a new resolve that kind of puts everything into focus for him. And I wouldn't mind betting that next time we see Uther, he is noticeably more like his old self, as he realizes now who the real enemy is. And also, and this isn't really important, but new Uther looks just like Evitel's dad, and that definitely makes me like him perhaps more than I should. Another nice detail is that the corrupted wound to Uther's heart is prominently in the foreground of the shot, just as Claire is saying that Anduin is
one whose heart is true.
The words are saying one thing, the images are showing us a wound to the heart that is literally throbbing with the Jailer's power. It's really cool. And about 5 hours ago, I said Uther's apparent mistaking Anduin for Arthas does 3 things. So number 3, it shows us someone seeing Anduin not as Anduin, but as someone else. I don't think I have to say any more about that.
Very well. He may approach.
And at this point, with the tension dial running out of notches to hit, we should all be very worried about which Anduin has turned up at Elysian Hold.
Step forward.
And as the Archon invites Anduin to step forward, and we still haven't seen his face, which the rules of filmmaking dictate we really should have done by now if everything were normal and not something to be very worried about. And when we finally do see his eyes,
My Ascended have spoken of you. The king held captive in the Maw.
That prison could not hold me forever.
they are not looking at the Archon who he is talking to. 100-mile stare being a normal conventional shorthand for showing that a character is possessed or zombified in some way. And this line, that prison could not hold me forever, is obviously very deep with meaning, because it would make sense for Anduin to say it if everything were normal, but of course we've now worked out that everything is far from normal, and if we hadn't worked it out, then the tension building strings in the music here really should have shown us everything is far from normal. So we know that this is the jailer talking about his prison, the prison which the Archon and the other Eternals banished him to for reasons still unknown. And now we know that this is something's not quite right. What are you hiding, Anduin? Then Blizz can really lay it on thick, and they do.
Why have you come to Bastion?
You have a key that I need.
With this evil tilt of the head, we all recognize a tilt of the head like this to be evil, right? I mean, that's just something we all inherently have learned to read from fictional media, and the grimace on his face and the lowering of his voice as he says that the Archon has a key that he needs. We all noticed that, but another really good way that Blizz expresses the menace that Anduin exudes here is the way he doesn't stop walking. From the moment the Archon invites him to step forward, Anduin is walking right at her, and he doesn't stop. Like, at some point, you need to stop, probably around here, maybe give a bow or whatever, and offer your sword to the noble cause, I don't know, but this bad boy Anduin doesn't stop. He just keeps very consistently striding towards her, and it isn't until she has that moment of recognition.
You will release this soul from your grasp.
Where she realizes it is her brother, Zovaal, talking to her through this vessel, that she trains her massive spear at him and finally brings him to a halt. And this moment, when the Archon has her realization, is incredibly important from a character perspective too, because it gives you a sense of who she is. Blizzard have, in my opinion, worked incredibly hard to show us that the Winter Queen and the Archon are good in a way that we can recognize. When the Winter Queen's people ask her to save Ysera's pod, she reluctantly agrees, but she doesn't ask anything of her people. She uses her own life force to fulfill her people's wishes, not drawing any anima from the zone to do it. The sacrifice is all hers. The Archon's selflessness is a bit more subtle, but we see it in her reflection and willingness to blame herself for the trouble Bastion is in at the beginning of the cinematic, and we see it here too. When she realizes that the mother-shitting jailer is standing in front of her, what does she do? Instantly decapitate him? She definitely could, and she probably should, but no. Instead, her first thought is for Anduin, the innocent vessel that the jailer is controlling. She knows her brother must have a plan. She knows she must be in danger right here. She has no idea who Anduin is or any reason to care about him, but her first priority is for the innocent mortal who doesn't belong here, and that should tell us something about the Archon, I think. And you know what? Knowing that the Archon's compassion for an innocent soul would make her hesitate in just wiping this guy out may well have been part of the plan, because it's here that the jailer makes his move.
No. He is bound to me.
Just as you once sought to bind your own brother.
The Mournblade that was Charlemagne and is now Kingsmourne, and I might be in the minority here, but that is a much cooler name, fair play, assembles in Anduin's hands as the jailer drops any pretense at disguise, his plan having worked and delivered him to the Archon, declaring his own righteousness as he has done this whole expansion. And is his righteousness justified? Was he really so wronged by the other Eternal Ones? Denathrius clearly thought so, and I'm sure we'll find out for sure, but what with Blizz working so hard to show how genuinely good the remaining Eternal Ones are, I find it likely it'll turn out that they were probably kind of justified in locking Zovaal away. I love that the jailer here uses an ability that we've seen him use before in the opening scenario, a power that Anduin was the last line of defense against, and let us, the player, escape. The irony of Anduin now being the vessel to bring this power into the Kyrian Sanctum being heavy and explicit. I love this statue just symbolically crumbling behind the Archon here, as the jailer metaphorically and literally smashes the pretense and projected strength of Elysian hold and brings it crumbling around him in his wrath. And that messed up jailer messing shit up music plays like it did when Sylvanas shattered the sky above Icecrown. The "oh no, Anduin, oh shit, he's totally possessed, ah damn, it's all going down, oh no, the Archon's gonna dead." And this moment, the real money shot of the cinematic. where through that black smoke, Anduin launches himself at the Archon, his appearance changing now to his more Covenant transmog set, and so many references here. First of all, the way that he bursts through the smoke with his blade rays is obviously reminiscent of his bestie Rathian bursting through the smoke to lay the telling blow on the carapace of N'Zoth in 8.3, which feels more like a cool reference than anything meaningful, but I'm happy to be wrong if anyone has any ideas. But of course, it will also make most of us think about Anduin's father, Varian, sacrificing himself to take out the Fell Reaver on the Broken Shore. The tragedy of Anduin, a king so genuinely good-hearted that the jailer was able to use him to smuggle himself into Elysian hold, recreating his father's heroic leap, but to commit a terrible act of destruction being almost too sad to think about. It also makes us think of Varian Rin. Haven't thought about him for a while, and I wonder if there's a reason for that. When the hit comes, it is brutal, taking the Archon down into blackout, and as we see a sight that we are used to. A soul seemingly being devoured by a Mournblade, that Kyrian sigil glowing on the Archon's chest and being drawn into it. This moment of Anduin becoming himself, just for a second. And the horror in his face as he sees what he's done. And it is horrible, it is tragic, but for us as an audience, it's almost a moment of hope, because it shows us that Anduin still exists, that he is still in there. This isn't a corrupted Anduin. He's not choosing to walk this path like Arthas did. He resisted Sylvanas' attempts to turn him and had to be compelled completely against his will. And if he's still in there, he can be saved. Is he coming back into himself in this moment, his strength showing through the jailer's domination of him, or is it an example of the jailer's cruelty, allowing the boy king back for a second to witness the terrible act of violence he's just committed? Either way, it doesn't last long, because the runes on his armor glow bright once again, and Anduin is brought back under control. This slight hand movement from the Archon as the blade is withdrawn has been confirmed by Steve Denuza as a sign that the Archon survives this attack, so it'll be really interesting to see just how functional she is come 9.1. As zombie Anduin, now in full unambiguous control by the jailer mode, and by the way, the third class we've seen him play in this game, because he started as a priest, then he looked a bit like a paladin, and now totally a DK. Doing the 1,000-yard stare and showing no emotion, robotically stands up and walks away as Torghast and the Maw crossfade into the scene, and it's almost like Bastion's skybox itself is being filled with this symbol of the jailer's power, his tower of power. And he's understandably quite happy about how his afternoon is going so far.
The vessel performed its part flawlessly. 3 keys remain. Then they will see. Death was never meant to be chained.
His plan totally worked. The Archon is defeated and her sigil, or key, is his. And as he takes it from the Mournblade, he says, 3 keys remain. Which, okay, just so you know, this one sentence is going to keep the whole WoW content creating community in videos until the next patch, because it raises a fair few questions, doesn't it? How many keys are there? Who has them? And why does the jailer need them? So let's tackle that, shall we? It seems pretty logical to suggest that because we just took a key from the Archon, the keys are held or associated with the Eternal Ones who lead each faction. Doubly so when you consider that it was they that locked the jailer away. It makes sense he would need their keys to free himself. So that would make, on the face of it, 4 keys. So which 3 keys remain?
It makes sense that he already has Denathrius' key, because they've been working together. They're best buds. He'd have given it to him.
And of course, we've just seen him steal the Archon's key. Definitely the Winter Queen. Presumably the Primus in some way. Since the Primus is definitely the Rune Carver and under the Jailer's control already, wouldn't Zovaal have just taken his key by now too? Actually, that's got a much more obvious and interesting answer, because we know that the Primus saw that the Jailer was growing in power before any of the other Eternal Ones did, and that's why he went missing. It is absolutely possible that he would have stowed his key with a powerful member of his covenant for safekeeping. And now you mention it...
I offer the key to saving Maldraxxus.
He gave me no key.
An unyielding warrior with the skills of a master spy. A key to many things.
Draka is referred to in the Maldraxxus Afterlife cinematic as a key. But you know, maybe one of the keys is out there in another zone, like perhaps Korthia, which the Jailer just so happens to be dragging into the moor on big chains, and apparently, according to Jeremy Fiesel, is full of Dreadlords. It's also quite possible that the Sorting Hat, the Arbiter, is a key as well, since she's referred to in the Maldraxxus campaign as being the final key. Right, okay, yeah, so that's 5 keys then. And if there are 5 keys, doesn't that fit rather neatly with the famous Ilgynoth whisper? 5 keys to open our way, 5 torches to light our path, especially as that Archon sigil absolutely glows like a torch. Could the Jailer be working with the Void Lords? Or could he be inadvertently paving the way for the Void Lords? Or could he be totally using the Void Lords? I've got to say, I always think the 5 key whisper is one that we always need to be very wary of reading too much into, because it kind of handily fits any situation. Like, at first everyone thought it was the 5 pillars of creation, which it still could be. People have speculated it could be world trees, because one is a lot like a torch, or any number of things. But yes, it absolutely could be the keys the Jailer is talking about. You see what I'm saying? There is a lot of speculation to happen around all of this key stuff. Something we can more confidently read into here is Sylvanas' look as zombie robot Anduin hands over the key.
3 keys remain. Then they will see.
Because we know how important it was to her to win Anduin to their side of his own free will. And the reasons for that are pretty obvious. She never had a choice. Because of Arthas, she never had control. She was probably doomed to serve the Jailer from the moment Arthas raised her as a Banshee. And seeing the Jailer dominate this pure-hearted king into doing his will appears to strike a little close to home to her. Like, if people need to keep being controlled against their will to be on your side, maybe your side isn't quite as just as you keep telling yourself. Most people have reasonably interpreted this moment, I think, as a sign that there is doubt growing in Sylvanas as to the Jailer's motives. We've pointed out in previous analysis videos that Zovaal has clearly told Denathrius and Sylvanas different versions of what his actual final objective is. Denathrius says that the aim is for death to rule all the other forces. Sylvanas seems to think that the plan is to dismantle death entirely. And if I had to place a bet, I'd probably say Denathrius is the one who knows the real plan, since he never needed to be convinced to be on his brother's side. And Sylvanas may just now be starting to realise that she's being played a little bit here. And this brings me back to those Arthas parallels, and what I said earlier about how maybe Blizz are making those parallels specifically to show a difference. Because Arthas was the cause of Sylvanas' damnation, really. He killed her, and then out of spite, raised her as a Banshee, and in doing so, probably doomed her to serve the Jailer, even if she didn't know that until she threw herself from Icecrown at the end of Wrath. These very explicit parallels between Arthas and Anduin, down to baddie Moor Anduin even looking so much like Arthas it's unreal. Could this be because whereas Arthas was the one who damned Sylvanas, Anduin could be the one who saves her? How seeing what the Jailer is doing to him is the eventual catalyst that makes her turn against Zovaal in some important way. We know that Sylvanas is the final boss of the Sanctum of Domination raid in 9.1. Could that fight end with her saving us and joining us? And I want to make it clear, I'm not talking about a redemption for Sylvanas here. That's a much more complex and controversial and emotive issue. I mean Anduin somehow being the spur that allows Sylvanas, for the first time since she became the Banshee, to take back control. Or maybe Tyrande will just rock up and kill-steal her at the end of the fight. That could totally happen too, I guess. But Sylvanas finding agency through Anduin would be fitting, as well as really showing us the difference between him and Arthas. Anduin is fundamentally good. Arthas was eventually controlled by Frostmourne and the Helm of Domination, but it was his own decisions, his own actions that led him to that point. Anduin had to be compelled to do the bad things and is still able to be saved as a result. Maybe Arthas can be saved too. I'm sure he's going to have a big part to play later on in the expansion, but you know what I'm saying. I have a prediction that I want to put out there right now. One final Arthas-Anduin parallel which we will get by the end of this expansion, again to show the difference between the two. At some point, we will fight the jailer-controlled Anduin. I think that's pretty certain. What if, through a series of events, that fight were to take place on Icecrown? What if, when we defeat Jailer Anduin, his body slumps down and a cinematic starts, and for a second we think we are watching the Wrath of the Lich King ending cinematic, as Anduin gasps for breath and we realise his head is being cradled by a vision of his father, Varian Wrynn. "Father," he says, "is it over?" And Varian looks down at his own son in his arms and frowns and says, "No. Be strong, my son. Get to your feet. You have a world to save." At which point, Anduin's theme starts to play, and he gasps a huge intake of breath as the jailer is expelled from his noble host, and as Anduin stands in control of himself once more, with the final battle against the now manifested jailer in front of him and your raid team, he raises Charlemagne and cries, like his father before him at the Broken Shore, "For Azeroth." But what do you guys think? Are you in love with this cinematic as much as I am, or were you genuinely a bit underwhelmed by it? I've seen people express both opinions online for sure. How many keys are there, and who holds them? What does the future have in store for Sylvanas and Anduin? When will Arthas make his appearance? I would genuinely love to hear your comments below, because this is the fun time for ideas and speculation, fam. Let's enjoy it. And thank you for joining us today. If you like this video, don't thank us. Thank our patrons who give their actual real-life money to make all of our work happen. And seriously, thank you, because you are very special and you smell nice. And without you, there would be a whole lot less Taliesin Evitel. If you didn't like it, and that's fair because it's just been me talking for a long time at the end of the day, downvote the shit out of it. Remember, my name is the Primus. I mean, the Rune Carver. I mean, Taliesin. From me and Evitel and the Nyrin too. Until next time, cheerio.